You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Back in December, specifically, it was on the day that the city of Memphis removed the statues for General Nathan Bedford Forrest and Confederate President Jefferson Davis. I received a phone call from one of our Dixie Heritage subscribers, an author by the name of Al Arnold. Al is a black man. He spent his whole life living in Mississippi, graduated from the University of Mississippi. He's also a physical therapist by occupation. But a few years back, he discovered his Confederate ancestry, and as a result of that, he wrote a book on the life and the experiences of his great-great-grandfather called An Orderly for Lee. What Al Arnold discovered was that his great-great-grandfather had been a slave of General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest had freed his great-great-grandfather, and as a free black man, his great-great-grandfather enlisted in the Confederate Army and ultimately ended up serving as the personal orderly of General Robert E. Lee, and because of that, was actually a witness to the surrender at Appomattox. And so I was talking to Al, and we talked about a lot of things during the interview. General Nathan Bedford Forrest, we talked about why he believes that the Forrest statue should remain in place. We talked about Al's journey of embracing his Confederate heritage, about his ancestor and his Confederate service. We talk about a lot of things, and so let's go to that phone call now. We'll begin. At the beginning of the phone call, we were talking about, of all things, the Dukes of Hazzard, so we'll begin there.
On the back of my book is a salute to the Dukes of Hazzard.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the generation that I came up.
I'll say, who didn't like the Dukes of Hazzard?
Right.
When I was a kid, I think the first person I fell in love with was Daisy Duke.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I have a little caption on the back of my book about that very thing.
And so, how old are you?
49.
You're 49. Okay, I'm 45 because I looked at the picture. You've aged well because I looked at your picture and I thought you were younger than myself. So,
yeah, I got a thing here. I call it a generation when race didn't matter. Mm-hmm. I said it was the Dukes of Hazzard generation, the time when the general was every boy's dream and Daisy was every girl's envy.
Yep. Well, have you ever met Catherine Bach, the lady who played Daisy Duke?
I have not.
Maybe 10 years ago, I had the privilege of meeting her. Mm-hmm. And it was at a Sons of Confederate Veterans event.
Wow.
Let me just say, she looks every bit as good. At least she did 10 years ago. She did when we were kids.
Funny. That's great.
And she was wearing cut-off jeans. Ellie Mae Clampett from the Beverly Hillbillies did not age that well.
God Bless America Again conference is coming to Ocala, Florida, January 26th and 27th. Starts at noon each day at the Southeast Livestock Pavilion, 2282 Northeast Jacksonville Road. It's going to be a time of prayer, praise, and testimony, and some of the best in Christian gospel music. Everyone's invited. Tickets, you don't need no ticket. It's a free event. Call 352-250-1771 for more information.
Yeah, I guess you've been in Mississippi your entire life.
Entire life. Love the great state of Mississippi.
Well, let me ask you this, because I know that you're in tune with Confederate heritage.
Right.
What do you think about the state flag being changed in Mississippi?
Well, I mean, obviously, I don't support it being changed. You know, one of the chapters in my book is on my beloved state and the Confederate, the state flag. So I take a pretty strong position on heritage, what I think it means and what it doesn't mean.
Right.
So I think it would be a tragedy to change it. I mean, from one perspective, as an African American, I don't want to ever be in an environment where I only see the things that I like.
Right.
So before my discovery of my Confederate heritage, my position was the flag meant so much to so many people that it didn't offend me because so many people loved it. But yet it gave me an opportunity to glimpse at history from a viewpoint that I don't ever want to forget.
Right.
And so one of the problems is when people have been so propagandized, as I call it, to where they want to live in a society where they only want to see things that they like. And so that was my initial thrust of my intellectual thought on it. And I talk about that in the book. And of course, obviously, things became a little bit more personal and a little bit more connected as I discovered my own Confederate heritage and the meaning of what that was all about for me. And so, yeah.
Well, I grew up in Chicago, and when you would get to about Effingham, Illinois, you would start to see Confederate flags. Used to call them rebel flags when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And you would start to see them when you would get to about Effingham, Illinois. And of course, the further south you got, the more you would see. And it was just, as far as I was concerned as a little kid, driving down the interstate, basically it just meant I was getting further south.
Right.
Of course, grew up there in Mississippi and graduated from Jackson State University. You graduated from the University of Mississippi. Of course, I know the University of Mississippi has a lot of Confederate heritage in its tradition, or at least it used to. I know it's purged itself of those things, but when you were a student at the University of Mississippi, did you, and the reason I'm asking you this question the way I'm asking it is because I know you've heard what we're hearing, be it on CNN, be it, reading pieces in the Washington Times or the New York Times or any of the mainstream media outlets. Students at the University of Mississippi, students of color in particular, are saying that they feel violated, that they feel personally attacked, having to look at the state flag, or that the Colonel Reb mascot was somehow personally offensive to them. When you were a student at the University of Mississippi, did you have that sentiment, or was it, what was that like for you, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, first thing I need to make sure that I clarify is I graduated from the School of Physical Therapy, which was not on the main campus.
Okay.
But it was very much still the University of Mississippi, in that the only medical school in the state where a lot of the medical degrees are awarded, including the degree of physical therapy, is in a branch in the capital city of Jackson. So with that being said, that gives you a little context. My college experience was largely from a historically black college to an all-white experience at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, which, again, flew under the banner of the University of Mississippi. I was the only black male in a class of 42. And I had a very good experience with my classmates. I had a very good experience with my professors. And I had a great journey. I talk about in my book of only having one racial experience that I would consider to be a racial experience at all, but I had quite a few of those at Jackson State in a historically black college, so I didn't count that as a negative. Largely, in some regards, we were discouraged to go to the University of Mississippi from those who felt like the university did not represent beliefs that were allowing us to matriculate successfully through the school. Some professors, some students who may have had a bad experience, but overwhelmingly, I just didn't find that to be the case. And I did have a great opportunity to fraternize with a lot of fraternity brothers who were at the University of Ole Miss in Oxford. And the fraternity that I was in, we would gravitate to all of these different campuses. And our college experience was not gripped in the racial experience that we have today. We shared a common fraternal bond with multiple fraternities on multiple white college campuses among my black fraternity. My generation, I think, was just a little bit different in that regard. But no, I didn't have that experience. I was at the University of Mississippi Medical Center for 2 years, had a very good experience, had very good professors, and successfully graduated from the college. And so I found out that a lot of stereotypes about the university was just not true when I got there. And so, right. Yeah, I think that's the thing that I talk about a lot in my book is, having contact with people helps to dispel a lot of myths that are out there.
Were you a college student before or after, or during the process of, in other words, time frame? Was your college experience before or after you had discovered your Confederate ancestor?
It was very much before.
Okay.
Yeah, very much before.
Okay, and so
Um,
at that time, being someone who was not yet in tune with their Confederate heritage, for example, if you went to a football game and saw the Colonel Reb, running around, or you saw the battle flags waving or the playing of Dixie at the football game, did that have any effect on you at that time, or no?
well, I was very much from a college student indoctrinated at a historically black college.
Okay.
My my college experience, I would say, was largely black. But needless to say, I've grown up in Mississippi all of my life. I was raised practically an hour away from Ole Miss and about 45 minutes away from Mississippi State. And so I'm very familiar with the cultural norms of the state and all of the Colonel Reb and the Rebels and the football and the Dixie. Those are things that, again, even when I was in a historically black college, those were things that just didn't get me riled up.
Okay.
I mean, I don't ever remember being at Jackson State at a predominantly historically black college in a black fraternity ever having even the slightest conversations about these things among students. These things were not our primary concerns. We were told by some professors, again, some students, that school was not for us professionally, that we would do better applying to other schools. What I'm saying is, I just found that not to be the case. When I actually did apply and got accepted, we were treated just like any other student and was expected to be, you know, very competitive, and it was a great educational experience. And so I'm very proud that my college experience began with indoctrination of my black heritage, and it ended at an all-white school. That I'm proud to say that my graduation from the University of Mississippi is just as a bigger part of who I am as anything.
So, when we may be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves as far as the interview is concerned, but you talk about your college experience and that being very much an upbringing in black heritage, and of course now we're talking about Confederate heritage, and the assumption is that the two must be exclusive of each other and even in conflict with each other, but obviously that's not the case in your life.
Very much not the case, and that's the irony of it all. Is people love history when the narrative comes out kind of the way they like it. History is just so much more dynamic. People are just so much more dynamic than just black and white. I've learned to appreciate that. It doesn't conflict itself at all because it culminates in who I've become and who I am. Largely, I just find that a lot of people are just mad today.
Right.
And, I'm not a mad person. And so I think that helps a lot. With the propaganda of the day, you have to be mad. Someone has to be wrong, and someone has to be telling a lie in order for people to feel good about themselves. I just don't have that hang up.
Right. Well, I know my personal observation has been that I had no idea that those on the left side of the political spectrum were even capable. I did not know human beings at all were even capable of expressing hatred and just, if this is even a word, vitriolity
Yes.
to the extent and to the extreme that we've been seeing it since Donald Trump has been elected president.
Well, I just wrote a Facebook post on propaganda. No one likes propaganda, in particular when they become victims of it. The only thing that's separating man from his utter depravity of destroying each other is the means to do it.
Right.
It's, it's not that he won't do it. He just doesn't have the means to do it. And so when you look back over society, you have these great crises of humanity. The common element of destruction always centers around not humanity's willingness to destroy its enemy, but the means and the environment to do so.
Right.
So I'm not surprised at all. Yeah, hatred is real, and the two-party system that we have in this society is, in my opinion, is a big part of the problem. And that hatred is spewed on both sides. It's just seems so visceral right now to the right because, yeah, the left is really showing its ugly head against this president in all regards. And so,
if you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. To move on a little bit, when did you come to find out that you had a Confederate ancestor?
so it was 2008 at a family reunion. I went to a family reunion, a large black family up in Northeast Mississippi, and we have a family reunion every year. And this particular family reunion, we had a heritage book revealed, which is a family book. It's a very precious item in my possession of all of the family members in my family that's ever been born at that time. And it's just a chronological history of who we are and very well professionally done. And when I got to the page on my great-great-grandfather, there was a little newspaper article in the book that suggested that he was an orderly for Robert E. Lee in the Civil War. It was dated 1941, and so that article was the first evidence that I saw that perhaps I had someone who was hanging out with Robert E. Lee in the Civil War. I thought it was pretty cool.
Okay.
Educated man at the time. I love history, loved Civil War history even before this. I just loved history even when I was in school, in high school. So that article opened up my eyes to that possibility, and I began to research to see if I could make the connections. And one thing led to another, and find out that I have an ancestor who not only was with Robert E. Lee, but was very proud of it all of his adult life.
How did finding out about having a Confederate ancestor specifically cause you to, I guess you could say, embrace that Confederate heritage?
Well, first of all, I'm a Christian. I hold high to my Christian values of the Reformed faith, if you will, understanding big God theology and God's sovereignty, and understanding his sovereignty over history. And it was very clear to me that, one, I wanted to preserve the story for my family. That was most important, because this person was a very prominent person in our family. He was my grandmother's grandfather, so she was very proud of him. And she always kept him before us, so we knew who he was. We had this photo of him that we had looked at all the time as I was a little kid growing up. He wasn't somebody that was so distant from us that we didn't know who he was. He was Papa Turner to us. So the most important thing was to preserve it for my family, but the greater value of this story, I thought at the time, and I still think, is the redemptive story of grace and forgiveness, and the Christian motive of reconciling with your brother, and just the sheer humor that God uses sometimes in showing us how we have more in common than we think with our brothers who are different than us.
Right.
And that was the real motive behind the book, was to preserve it for my family, so that the generations ahead would know this story but more importantly, to tell the greater story of redemption, story of grace, story of forgiveness and reconciliation.
We'll talk about the book here in a minute, but before we do, I want to ask you one more question, just something that I saw on your website. You made the comment about Confederate history being black history, or
Yeah.
elaborate on that a little bit.
Unfortunately, black history has been isolated to just one era of time, from the civil rights era forward. And what people don't seem to understand is that, black history is included in every aspect of America's story, including the history of the war between the states. That era is a period of time where black people were really written out of the history books by both sides, I would say. Northerners wrote the story after the war. They did not do a good job of including the life and the roles of African Americans during that struggle. And neither did the Lost Cause writers. So both Northerners and Southerners, in my opinion, relegated the black man to just a slave, and therefore his story in this period of time is not well known. So you have men like Hope Collier from Greenwood, Mississippi, who led Teddy Roosevelt through the swamps of Mississippi in the famous black bear hunts, where we now know the famous toy, the teddy bear, was first termed after this hunt. Hope Collier was a black Confederate attached to a regiment over in Texas. He was from Mississippi. He killed more bears than Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone combined. But nobody knows his story because he was a black man during an era of time when black men didn't have stories.
Right.
And so I'm trying to reclaim those stories and not allow slavery or the era of the time or the negativity that even blacks have against people of that day to bury those stories. Those stories are our stories. I mean, they're a part of who we are, and they need to be told. So yeah, Confederate heritage is if 1 in 7 slaves go north, what happened to the 6 out of the 7 that stayed south?
Right.
All of them didn't go north. And these men would have made decisions for a variety of reasons to do a lot of different things in a lot of different capacities, including serving and working and aligning themselves with the Confederate states.
Well, we have a talk radio DJ here locally in Central Florida, and he got into a little bit of hot water recently because somebody had called him, and it was not myself, but it is somebody who subscribes to the Dixie Heritage newsletter. But he called the radio show one morning, and he asked a question. It was at the time when they were taking down the old Joe statue in downtown Gainesville, if you remember reading about that.
Yeah.
The radio host, his name's Bob Rose, he made the statement. He said, I know that there aren't supposed to be black Confederates, and I know the Civil War was supposed to be only about slavery. He said, but the reality is that there were black people who stayed in the South. And by the way, Bob Rose is a Yankee. He moved down here to work on the radio show.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I don't want to get into the whole subject of the Civil War here. He said, but something can't be as we're being told. He said, because obviously a lot of black people were in the South. There were people from another country that came in, that invaded, that they were fighting. He said, and I guarantee that those black Confederate soldiers weren't fighting to maintain their slavery, so the war had to be about something else.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's people are dynamic, and that's one of the things that we don't give them credit for back then. We want to make things just all black and white and not realize that people were very diverse then, very complicated, just as they are now.
Right.
Nothing has changed in that regard.
And so why do you think it is, for example, I've loved baseball my entire life, coached baseball most of my adult life, played competitively when I was younger. And I look at Jackie Robinson and he's a great baseball player.
Mm-hmm.
You go beyond even Dr. King, his predecessor was Dr. Vernon Johns. I'm sure that's a name that's familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who by profession is a Baptist preacher, I look at a Dr. Vernon Johns and say, here was a great theologian, here was a great pulpiteer. Why can't, say, a young black person, a young black boy, for example, why can't he look at a General Lee or a Stonewall Jackson and just see a great military leader or a great historical figure?
Well, I mean, that's kind of how I view. When you say why can't he, that's exactly the position that I had before my coming to understand my own Confederate heritage. I looked at Robert E. Lee as, a man who very well could have served the Union Army, asked to be general of the whole Union Army at the onset of the war. He was just a military genius. So I valued his service and his intellect and even his character as a person of his day, as one of the great men and founders of this country. But one of the things that propaganda does, it demonizes people. It has to demonize. Propaganda does not allow for complexity of thought. Propaganda allows for very simple thought: left, right, wrong, love, hate. That's where the great divide is now. We're seeing the end result of what propaganda does when it's just consistent negative connotations over and over and over. People lose their ability to think creatively. I'm glad I haven't lost that ability. But I did have a very strong love for history too, coming into this story. So, I was a kind of black guy that would go to Civil War shows before, just to go see what the guys had. I just loved it. So
I'm going to ask you a question. I'm not trying to put you on the spot here. But before you found out that you had a Confederate ancestor, if you would go to a Civil War reenactment, who were you cheering for?
I've been asked all questions, so I can't be put on the spot, right? I had enough common sense to know Yankees had slaves too.
Right. They did. That's right.
and they and they and I had enough common sense to know that the Underground Railroad wasn't in New York. The end of it was in Canada. Hell, we were trying to get out of the whole country. You see what I'm saying? So I take great pleasure in the man. I take great pleasure in the soldier, in the general. I take great pleasure in the story. Who is this man? What makes him? I had men on both sides of the war that I thought were great men. I mean, one of my favorite was old slow trotting Tom from over in Georgia, who was a Southerner that was a Yankee general. He was, basically disbanded by his family for fighting against the Southerners, but he was one hell of a general. What do you do with a guy like Nathan Bedford Forrest? I mean, here's a guy who wasn't even trained among the generals at West Point, but was a military genius.
Right. Of course, I'm sure you know the history. Forrest tried to free his slaves, and they refused to go, and essentially they became his personal bodyguards during the course of the war.
Yeah, so I just love, I think that's one of the advantages that I did have is my love for history, and I did have a propensity to study and to learn about the Civil War even before this story. So maybe that helped me. I don't know. It's still been a very difficult thing, if you can imagine. It's still been a very difficult thing, not to embrace, but to write about and to make yourself subject to all kind of scorn and ridicule and misunderstandings, but for the sake of the gospel, I think it's worth the risk.
So then what kind of ridicule or what kind of negative feedback have you been getting then, having written the book?
So I get it from all angles. That's the most surprising thing. Don't expect to hear. The natural thing is that they expect I would get it from black folks. I mean, that's obvious. For some people, I don't go far enough. For the South, I don't go far enough. And then for the Yankees, sometimes for them, I go too far. And so that's the whole narrative with the Civil War is in Confederate heritage, everybody has an angle. Everybody comes to the table with a story and a narrative, and they don't want it to be altered. They don't want it to be altered. And so I get criticism from a lot of different sources, but, I take it on the chin and I move on. But yeah, I get it from all angles. Probably my worst critics are the Yankees.
Okay.
The Yankee is he is dead set on not allowing Southerners to have any pride. And there are guys out here who loathe the idea of a black Confederate. I mean, I had no idea it was that strong. I came home after I wrote the book. I told my wife, I said, hell, the war is still going on. She said, what war? I said, the Civil War. The Yankees and the Confederates are still fighting. I had no idea that the animosity was that strong. And so here I am as a black man trying to restore some hope and dignity back to my white Southern brothers. And the Yankee just forbids to allow me to do that.
Right. Do you know H.K. Edgerton, or I'm sure you know who he is, even if you don't?
I had the pleasure to meet that gentleman one time. Know him. I could say from that one experience, I've had a good time with him. Yeah, I do know him, and I met him out in Texas last year. He and I was at an event together. Quite a character. Quite a gentleman.
Because he is definitely a living illustration of the fact that the Yankees will not abide a black Confederate.
Yeah, very much so.
Do you know another gentleman? His name's Dr. Nelson Winbush.
I know of him. Have not had the privilege of meeting him. I understand he's of age right now, and
he is.
Don't get out as much as he used to.
And he was, for years, he was the superintendent of schools in the Orlando.
Yeah. Yes.
And he was, I want to say, the president of the NAACP.
Right, he was. Yeah, I'm very familiar with his story. It's not that many of us around, so I think if nothing else, we keep up with each other in terms of, if we haven't met, we perhaps have read about each other. So,
but I know that was his argument, was when historians and educators would tell him that there were no black Confederates. He said, I know they were because my grandfather was one and he introduced me to hundreds of others.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, his grandfather was one. He has a real amazing story.
And tell me about your ancestor, specifically who he was, what his name was, and just tell me all about.
I knew him as Papa Turner in terms of, he was introduced to me again through a family photo. We had this photo in the family for some time, and he had these big buttons on his coat. And all we knew is that, he was a slave, and he was my grandmother's grandfather, and we called him Papa Turner because that's what she called him. And lo and behold, Papa Turner, his name was Turner Hall. I discovered this article that he was with Robert E. Lee in the Civil War as an orderly. And what really struck me was the blacks and the whites in his community held him to be a hero. And that was in 1941 out in Oklahoma. He was a very celebrated man on both sides of the community because of his service to Robert E. Lee. I thought that was very strange. He was so celebrated that they sent him to New York City to be interviewed on We the People, which is a national talk radio show. That was 1941. In 1938, he went to the Gettysburg reunion, which was the last reunion of the Blue and Grays, and it was the 75th reunion, and so he was there as a black Confederate. He went with about 66 other men from Oklahoma on an all-expense-paid trip out there. And then he was a guest of honor at a local parade in 1940 in Hugo. Guest of honor for the local parade, again, for his service to Robert E. Lee. So he was a traveled man. I thought, it was interesting for his day and time to have been a slave, perhaps, and gone through the Civil War 4 years. And then 72 years later, he has a gift given to him by Nathan Bedford Forrest. He says the most valuable thing he had in life. I was like, wow. He's cherishing his time as a black man who had served in the Confederate armies. And he's going to these reunions, and he's a very well-respected man. And he was a carpenter by trade, and he died in 1942 at the age of 102. I did find out that originally he was from North Carolina, he came back to Oklahoma, Mississippi after the war, which is right outside of Tupelo. And so I was born in Oklahoma 103 years after the war. So our roots were still there. From Oklahoma, Mississippi, he ended up moving about 1906, 1902, somewhere in that time. He moved out to Oklahoma with the family that he had served for like 5 generations. And so it's kind of interesting how his story got preserved in the paper. He had a friend of his that was a young man who had befriended him. And every time something would happen, like a birthday celebration, or he goes on a trip, this guy was the newspaper editor, and he would write an article on my grandfather. And so that's how I largely discovered a lot of his story.
You're telling me that your great-grandfather, who obviously at the time he moved to Oklahoma was not a slave, he was a free man, but yet he moved to Oklahoma so that he could be with the family that had held him in slavery previously. Is that what I'm understanding?
I haven't solved some of the puzzles to his story. I tend to have information to suggest that he was even free before the war. So when I wrote my first book, I didn't have that information. It wasn't clear to me. But as I've done more research in preparation for an epilogue to that book, it's clear to me that he had served his family for over 5 generations. And this was the last generation.
So in your book, do you talk about specifically in just your grandfather, or do you also write about the broader experience of black people serving in the Confederate Army and so forth?
So the book is about 3 things, and that's a great question. First of all, it's about my ancestor and my discovery of his story. I used the articles that I discovered on him to allow people to make what they will of the articles, and so I transcribed these articles in the book. So it's his story, then it's my story, a modern black man growing up in Mississippi, and how I came to embrace my Confederate heritage. So the book is also about me. It's about my experiences in Mississippi. It's about my racial experiences and my views as to issues regarding today's social ills and hang-ups over race and reconciliation. So I take my journey and his journey, and my journey is about me discovering who I am through him, going through a black college, going to Ole Miss, and coming out of this thing as a man that has a newfound understanding of who he is. And then I wrap those 2 stories around the greatest story, which is my Christian faith. So by God's grace, I'm both black and Confederate. I don't have to separate one from the other. I can rejoice in the creative work of God and who I am.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today. Well, there are, for example, Mary Tyler Moore, you know who she is, Hollywood, right, found out that her great-grandfather had served in the Confederate Army. And so she gave money and basically built what is now a museum. Whereas, of course, that was decades ago. Whereas now, I believe, given the climate in Hollywood, and maybe I'm wrong, had she found out that her ancestor was a Confederate, she would probably be on a talk show apologizing for it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is the time that we're in. Brian Gumbel found out he had a Confederate ancestor.
I'm interested in this story if you care to tell it.
Well, I mean, Brian Gumbel was shocked to find out that he had a Confederate ancestor that also fought on the Union Army. He was a Confederate first, then he fought with the Union Army. I mean, Keenan Avery Wanon, who is the famous comedian, discovered that his ancestor was kidnapped by the abolitionists and taken to Canada. He was one of the black men that actually made it all the way through the Underground Railroad. He escaped from the abolitionists and came back to South Carolina and said it was a great day to be back home. People were complex.
Right.
And that's a part of who we are as Americans. And so everything is not just this straight black and white narrative that people want to make it out to be, but the powers to be of today, the propaganda of the day, let me say it that way. It works. Propaganda works. It's effective. If I tell you over and over and over and over again that your history started in the 60s with the Civil Rights Movement, that's all you'll ever know. Your whole mind will be warped. It's not that I disrespect anything that my forefathers during the civil rights era did. I'm very grateful for it. I'm a byproduct of it. But you got to understand, I was born the year Martin Luther King was killed, so that's not my generation.
Right.
And I'm saying that it was a black man who was shot first in the Revolutionary War. Why do we have to start our history in the 60s? Why can't we go back to the Revolutionary War? I'm going to tell you an amazing thing that I discovered in this story. I had no clue going into this that Indians owned slaves. That was a real shock to me, that the 5 major tribes owned slaves, and they owned black slaves.
Which makes it harder for them to claim the victim status that they like to claim.
Well, I mean, do black people stop going to casinos now? Hell, I would take that. If you want to take down my Confederate flag, I would promote blacks stop going to casinos because it's destroying our families. Hey, I'm all for that. But what does that do to my Indian brother,
You talk about casinos. In Lake Charles, Louisiana, this was a number of years ago when I was pastoring in Texas. I used to travel to Lake Charles once a week to teach a college class there. And there were 5 casinos there at the time. And there was a pastor of a very large church in Lake Charles. It was predominantly a black Baptist church. And the pastor went on a personal crusade against the casinos. And he wasn't getting anywhere. And so finally, what he decided to do was, because the casinos had at that time they had a really inexpensive buffet. I think it was like 99 cents, and it had everything on it. It had crab, had lobster, and
Yeah.
he had 2,000-3,000 people in his services on Sunday morning, and he would load them up on buses, and they would go to the casino every Sunday after church and clean out that 99-cent buffet.
Look, and they not only cleaned out that buffet, they cleaned out those machines too, buddy.
Yeah.
Uh, Black churches all over the South are doing that. I mean, it's ironic, but yeah. I mean, I went to Oklahoma on a book event a couple months ago, and I was thinking about the Trail of Tears. And where I'm from, it was the Chickasaw Indians. From 1830 to about 1851, the Trail of Tears began, and these Indians began to go out to Oklahoma. And I was just thinking about how far my great-great-grandfather had made it away from home. Man, that's a long way. And he went on train, but those who were on the Trail of Tears walked. And one of the things that dawned on me, Ed, the whole time I was driving, was if the Indians had slaves, do you know who else would have been with those Indians on that Trail of Tears?
Yep.
They're slaves. Nobody ever told me that. I've never seen a depiction of the Trail of Tears showing the slaves. So here's another example of where black people just get written out of the story. But it's a known fact that all of those 5 tribes, Cherokee, the Creek, all of these tribes, the 5 major civilized tribes, had slaves with them on that Trail of Tears. And so I'm reading now some of the history of these tribes and the slaves that they own up in the area that I'm from. When the Presbyterian missionaries came in to evangelize the Indians, they first found that they had to evangelize some of the black slaves because they were easier to understand the language and to trust. And the Indians had more of a distrust. So it's been a wild ride of a journey of history. But yeah, that's a lot that people just don't give thought to. Dad, these people are just people, aren't they? And so I'm glad you're beginning to see that. They're people just like everybody else. They're humans. They have families. And then I took my son to the National Sons of Confederate Convention. He went with me up in my oldest boy. I don't have an indoctrination program with my kids. I've taught my kids to love people, to accept people. And I remember my daughter, when she saw some Confederate statues being stomped on the ground, she called me, and she was obviously, hurt because she was thinking about a guy that she had met out in Texas named Larry. And Larry was so nice to us and so gracious. And all she could think about was Larry and how that made him feel. And so that's the lesson to be learned when you're dealing with things that are different than you. What Jesus did is he always went towards people who were different than he was. He never just hung out with people who were like him. It was just, Martin Luther King said, one day, sons of the slave owner and sons of the slaves will sit down at the table of brotherly love. Well, for me, that day has come. And so I tell my African-American brothers, don't make an assumption about someone who's holding a Confederate flag unless you're willing to go sit at his table and eat with him and get to know him. And so you have all these people, they watch the news and they make these comments, those people, and yet they not one time knocked on the door of their neighbor and say, hey, can I sit down and have a meal with you and talk to you about this? And what is this all about? This is how we do Christianity, okay? We don't make judgments on people. We go and we sit down and we fellowship with people.
Tell me, how does somebody get a copy of your book?
So I have a website, orderlyforlee.com. Orderlyforlee.com. You can order the paperback version of my book. I have a color version of the new book that just came out on October 1. It's more of a youth college adult edition. I'm trying to get it into more mainstream education, so I added like 3 more chapters to it. I put some illustrations in it, and I got a guy named James Meredith, who was the first African American to integrate Ole Miss. James Meredith wrote the foreword to my new book. It's called Robert E. Lee's Orderly: A Black Youth Southern Inheritance. And again, on the back of that book, I call it a generation when race didn't matter. It was the Dukes of Hazzard generation, the time when the general was every boy's dream and Daisy was every girl's envy. So James Meredith wrote the foreword to this book, and I have a black and white copy of it as well as a colored version. I had a friend of mine who's a black guy who holds his Confederate heritage up in New York named Gregory Newsom. He did the illustrations for this book. And then the original book was a self-published book, but it's available also at my website. And then, of course, on Amazon, you can get the ebook of both. And you also can order the paperback book on Amazon. My publisher for the new book is in California. It's called Ink and Bean Press. And so I think you also can get it at Ink and Bean Press. But the new book by Ink and Bean Press is also available at any bookstore. You can go in and order it and request it. And they should be able to get it for you as well.
And its title is also Orderly for Lee?
Robert E. Lee's Orderly.
Robert E. Lee's Orderly.
A Black Man's Southern Journey is the first book. And Robert E. Lee's Orderly, A Black Youth Southern Inheritance is the second book. And for a signed copy, of course, you would have to go through my website because I actually ship them, sign them and ship them out myself.
Okay, very good. I want to just ask you 2 more questions before we go. You had mentioned extensively talking about your Christian faith, and I'm going to assume, given the fact that your grandfather worked so intimately with General Lee for several years, I know General Lee was a tremendous Christian gentleman. I've written the 17-chapter book where I totally ignore Lee's military career and write entirely on Lee, the Christian. It's called The Christian Testimony of General Robert E. Lee. And Lee was a dynamic Christian, and I know that he was also very evangelistic towards those that were around him. I'm sure that if your great-grandfather was not a Christian when he met General Lee, he probably became one being involved with General Lee. But I don't just want to assume that. So I'm going to ask the question, was your great-grandfather a Christian?
People of that day had fundamental Christian beliefs. I mean, I see it all throughout the war as I'm reading these stories of these men. I'm reading a book right now from a gentleman down in Raymond, Mississippi, the Battle of Champion Hill, the letters that he's writing to his wife, Matilda, and just some of the prayers that they prayed and the godly thoughts that they had. I mean, it's moving, you know, despite the circumstances. And Robert E. Lee was the epitome of that. You know, a guy who went through West Point without receiving a demerit. I don't think that's ever been done. He was a fine Christian gentleman in all sense of the word, and great Christian influence. The only thing that I can say with regards to my family is that the faith of my fathers were handed down to my fathers. My grandmother, my grandfather were Christians. Their parents were Christians. And the youngest daughter of my great-great-grandfather, Mama Will, who was my great-grandmother, was a great Christian. I do know that great-great-grandfather, he worked in the Christian church. He worked for 15 years in the Baptist church in Oklahoma. He worked at the Presbyterian church for over 10 years. He was a very faithful man with his word and with his deeds. He was revered by all of the kids in his community. And he knew everybody in his community by first name. Even at the age of 98, he had a very sharp memory and had a very quick step, according to the records. And so I believe his character would hold up. And I believe that he and Nathan Bedford Forrest are in the same heaven together right now. I believe that to the bottom of my heart, that in Christ, all things are reconciled. And there is only one heaven and one God. And when God told me that the Confederates are going to be in heaven too, I said, well, I might as well start loving them now. No need to wait until I get to heaven.
Right.
And so that's my belief that my ancestor in Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was his slave, he was Forrest's slave at one point. I believe they're in the same heaven. Not because of them, but because of the redemptive work of Christ.
Right.
And their trust in that.
So today, I don't know if you've seen the news or not. You probably have. You know that General Forrest's statue was, to put it politely, illegally removed from its pedestal in Memphis today.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that?
So I think it's a great tragedy. I wrote a Facebook post on my Facebook page, Orderly for Lee, where I speak specifically about General Forrest Monument and what I call the Hitler lights. This is the propaganda. Hitler used a lot of propaganda even before the great Christian persecutions in the year 303. There was a lot of propaganda leading up to the times of persecution. And what we're seeing is just the end results of what the propaganda of the day has led to. Years of propaganda against these things and unfortunate events like what happened out in Charleston. And the whole concept that there's a right and a wrong, there's a left and a right, there's love and hate, there can be no in between. People's hearts are so depraved that bitterness from 150 years ago can control and manipulate the thoughts and the hearts of people in the masses. And propaganda is that which does that. I think Nathan Bedford Forrest, my book, the chapter on him is called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. It's the longest chapter in my book, but it's also my favorite chapter. And here's where I get in a little trouble sometimes, where, Southerners would tend to make him a saint. Northerners want to make him a devil, and I make him just a man. But I think a great man who you didn't want to fight in the times of war. He was a great general. A big part of my book is centered around his salvation experience, who he was as a person in the redemptive story of grace. So here's my challenge to African Americans, and I've never had an African American push back against this. If you're going to destroy the statues of Nathan Bedford Forrest, or even take down the Confederate flag, I want every black church in America to never sing the song Amazing Grace again. In fact, I want you to take it out of your hymnal books. Because that song, Amazing Grace, was given to the church at the hands of a slave trader named John Newton, who did not stop trading slaves after he wrote the song. It was like 7 years afterwards before he stopped trading slaves. But the whole beauty of that song is that there is no sin that is beyond the reach of the grace of God, and we cheapen God's grace when we do things like what we're doing to a brother who has been redeemed in Christ. And then we take salvation upon our own hands because we are the ones now who are playing God. So, can you imagine a black church without Amazing Grace?
No, I can't.
It's the most ridiculous thing that you've ever heard. Well, neither can I imagine the South without its Confederate heritage. It's who we are in the South. It's a big part of the South. It is rooted. It is deeply ingrained. The descendants of Southern Confederates will always be in the South, and they have nothing to be ashamed of. Nothing to be ashamed of. There are no sins of our fathers that are held against us. And so I tell my Southern brother to hold your head up high. Hold to your heritage. Don't be ashamed of your heritage because other people won't hold to theirs. Everybody gets a right to hold to their heritage, but the Southerner. I don't get it. You got gay heritage, you got Italian heritage, you got Mexican heritage. The Southerner is a unique individual just like any other unique people group that God created. So he should be proud of that heritage, and he should not have to be ashamed of it.
Well, I definitely agree with you on that, and that's one of the reasons why for the last 2.5 years we've been working so hard with Dixie Heritage. Just trying to preserve, as I know you are, trying to preserve and even advocate for the good name of our ancestors.